Okay, welcome everyone to U.S. History 1302. This is part 2 of our lecture on the South and the West. And so, I'm going to try to move just a little bit faster today because we've got a lot to cover, but we've already talked a lot about Reconstruction. So a lot of the information in this chapter feels just a little bit redundant. It does kind of show the transformations that happen in the South after the end of Reconstruction. But probably the most important political development is 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson. Over Plessy, if you remember from yesterday, he argued that as a citizen of the United States, he had equal protection under the law and he had equal right to sit in the first class part of a train. But the segregation laws, the Jim Crow laws said otherwise. In Plessy v. Ferguson, the Supreme Court actually ruled 8-1 in favor of segregation. The Supreme Court said that as long as the separate facilities were equal, it was okay. Separate facilities based off of race were considered okay as long as they were equal. Okay, this set up the idea of the separate but equal doctrine, which is the legal justification for segregation throughout basically all of it. Until Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the Constitution was determined to say that segregation was okay by the Supreme Court because you could be separate but equal. You know, you can have the train car in the back of the train goes to the same place as the train car in the front of the train. It's an equal train ride. That's their idea. You know, the back of the bus is the same as the front of the bus. The black school is the same as the white school. That's the legal excuse. Now, in reality, separate but equal was never even true at all, okay? Most of the time, in just about every case, separate facilities for white and black people were totally different. And typically, the African-American facilities and public accommodations were inferior, including the accommodations regarding schools, regarding, public areas, shops, all those sorts of things. Black people tended to get the worst of it while white people got preference. So even though this court said it had to be equal, the South just focused on the separate part, okay? So segregation is legally justified by the Supreme Court until 1954, okay? Now, for many African Americans, their life of freedom was in some ways similar to their life in slavery. Now, freedom, we talked about it before, brought all kinds of benefits, the ability to move, the ability to be in control of your own family. Those sort of things are important. Freedom from whippings and the threat of all these different things that can happen in slavery is gone. But many African Americans continued their day-to-day lives as farmers, growing cotton. Okay, and we talked about sharecropping before last week, but the system that works out is that because the North does not bust up the big plantations, the white landholders still hold all the power. They have the land. African Americans can either work as like wage laborers on their farm, which is seen as like the lowest rung. African Americans can try to acquire their own land, which puts them up in high status among other African Americans, but that's very difficult. So a lot of African Americans opt for this middle option of sharecropping, where they rent land a lot of times from their own former masters, but they rent land from a white landlord and they pay their rent off with a share of their crop. When this system works well, African Americans, they pay off their debt. They're able to save up a little bit of money each year. They work again the next year. They work again the next year. And maybe over time, they save up enough money to buy their own land or to leave or to find opportunities elsewhere. But sadly, the case is often that sharecropping leads to generational poverty as black farmers get in debt, okay? They're indebted to their landlord and they're unable to pay back all their debts. Perhaps the cotton crop doesn't do very well this year. Perhaps they just have a run of bad luck. Okay, well, they get behind. And as a farmer, when you get behind, you still have to borrow money the next year to get started again. And you only get paid about once a year. And so we've talked about this before. I'm not going to belabor the point, but sharecropping is not an easy ticket to wild financial success. For many African Americans, their day-to-day life continues to be growing cotton, picking cotton, selling cotton, and cotton, and working hard, difficult manual labor. Sharecropping continues in the South for decades. Okay, it is not until the advent of like tractors that the South really moves away from sharecropping. Okay, there's a lot of sharecropping going on, and sharecropping is not limited only to Black people. There are white sharecroppers as well, but you often associate this more like poor white farmers often get into sharecropping arrangements too, but it's more commonly associated with Black farmers. Okay. In addition, we see that some African Americans, they just decide to leave. And later on, you'll see more and more of them, especially towards the turn of the century, around 1900, you see the Great Migration, where lots of African Americans move north to escape sharecropping. But this also leads to the South lagging behind even more in industry. The South is full of cheap labor. Economically, it's not that expensive to hire workers in the South, and wages tend to be low. Okay, that means that economically, farmers and landlords in the South don't really need to invest in more efficient farming practices. And so they tend to just kind of do the same thing over and over and over again, year after year after year. When you compare that to farms in the North and in the West, where you tend to have small farming families farming large tracts of land, that's where you see more emphasis on mechanical reapers and harvesters and threshing machines. And you start to see more and more labor-saving devices being used, which also leads to more efficient agriculture that produces more food with less people. So the farms in the rest of the country tend to be more advanced than in the South. In the South, they tend to run things like they always have, with not a lot of land and a lot of labor, okay? Now, some people try to revitalize the South after the war and to build up industry, okay? There's a lot of people that want to build a new South, okay? A way to change up the country and to build the South up and put it back on track with the rest of the world, okay? Now, these efforts are not entirely successful, but we do see some increases in industry, okay? All right. We see that a lot of it has to do with the railroads. One problem that the South had was that their railroads were often inconsistent, okay? All right, railroads go on track, right? The width of that track determines the width of the car that can go on the railroad. What makes sense is for all railroads to have the same width of a track, so every railroad car can go on every railroad. But in the South, that wasn't how it was. It was a hodgepodge, higgledy-piggledy mess, where there were lots of different widths of tracks. And so what would happen is you're trying to transport something. The railroad would get to the point where the railroad changes the width of the track. You have to unload all the stuff off of one train and put it on another train and then use that. So that's a big waste of time. So after the Civil War, you see the South standardize their railroads, and we see the South converting thousands and thousands of miles of line to be the same. From 1869 to 1909, industrial production in the South grew faster than the national rate, and you start to see a railroad boom and a boom in the textile industry, okay? The South does grow industrially, but they're still really far behind. Does that make sense? They're growing rapidly, but the rest of the country is really far ahead. What happens for a lot of these factories is they're textile factories. Textiles are like basic sheets of cloth. You take rough cotton, you spin it into thread, okay? You then weave that thread into a sheet of cloth that can then be used for other things like making clothing, making this, making that. It's like a textile is like the big piece of cloth, right? Well, in the past, people in the South had been shipping their cotton up to the north to be manufactured into textiles, or shipping it off to England to be manufactured in textiles. But in the South, they start to create textile factories so they can do it themselves. And this provides opportunities for different people to work and to have different opportunities to do things other than just be farmers, okay? Most of the new textile workers tended to be poor white Southerners escaping competition from black farm laborers or fleeing the hard scrabble life of the mountains. You see, as you see more and more African Americans be sharecroppers, there's a competition for that farm labor. And so white Southerners who aren't land owners, who can't be landlords, like the poor whites, many of them find jobs in these factories, okay? They hide, run out of their, mountain hollows and, or their little tiny, scrabble farms, and they move to the factories and they find a more stable income, okay? Another area of industry is in the tobacco industry, okay? The tobacco industry thrives in the South, okay? Americans grew an appreciation for cigar, snuff, and chewing tobacco a lot before the Civil War. But after the Civil War, we see the growth of cigarettes, okay? Cigarettes grow, and cigarettes become very popular in the urban cities of the North. And from 1860 to 1900, the annual rate of tobacco consumption nearly quadrupled. Americans spent more money on tobacco than on clothes or shoes. And this is still a thing today. People spend a lot of money on tobacco. This is just for free. Are you ready for your free advice for life from Mr. Baxley? Okay. If you want to have a new car one day, all you have to do is not smoke or chew tobacco or drink. Those three things are a lot of money. They're very expensive habits, okay? A typical pack of cigarettes is around $5 or $6, right? Right around there. I used to work at a gas station. One time I did the math.
$5 or $6?
$5 or $6 for a pack of cigarettes, which is about 20
God.
cigarettes, okay? Depending on how hard you smoke, but a lot of people who get really addicted to cigarettes smoke about a pack a day.
How do people
Okay.
afford that?
Well, that's a good question. Because if you do the math, okay, let's just say you're smoking the cheapos, okay, the cheap cigarettes, like $4 or $5 a pack, right? That's $5 a day. And let's say you smoke a pack every 2 days. Okay, let's be generous. Okay, so in a month, that's 5 times 15. Okay, that's 25. 5 times $75. Okay, so that's $75 a month. Okay, all right. That's a lot of money per month. Okay, that is about half of a car payment on like a medium level car. Okay, all right. Now, if you get real bad and you're smoking that every day, we're looking at, if it's 50 instead of that, and we do 30 days. You do that 30 days out of a month. You smoke a pack a day. It's $5. You're looking at $150 a month. Okay, multiply that times 12. Okay, and we've got 10, 2, 3, 50. You're looking at $1,800 a year. Okay, you're talking about a car payment. Okay? Over the course of your lifetime, when you look over 10 years, that's $18,000. Okay, when you look over that around 30 years, you're close to $60,000, and that's like, a cheap house. Okay, so you want to drive a nice new truck one day, Nathan? Don't smoke. All right. So, whoever you are. Anyways, moving on. Don't smoke. It's a bad habit, and it costs a lot of money. But for the people of the South, it actually provided opportunities for industry. Growing tobacco is an alternative to growing cotton. It becomes it had always been a cash crop, but it gets reinvigorated with the cigarette industry and the cigarette rolling industry. There's also the growth of timber and steel manufacturing, or timber harvesting and steel manufacturing in the South, okay? You start to see a lot more lumber yards and just chopping down trees for sale in the South, okay? And the timber industry was very, very successful in the South, but it also led to environmental costs, okay? The amount of trees that get chopped down in the South is to the point where you have really bad problems with erosion by the time you get to the 1930s, okay? If you drive through the South today, Like if you go on a road trip through Tennessee, you're going to see some beautiful green forests. And most of those forests, you might think, man, these forests must have been here for hundreds of years. They're probably only about 70, 80 years old. Okay, they probably planted in the 1930s during the New Deal. Well, they'd be around 90 years old now. Okay, because most of the forests in the South were chopped down either to make room for cotton or tobacco or to just sell the lumber. Okay, and there's a really bad devastation of the environment. A lot of this is done in the mountains. Okay, and when you chop trees on a mountain, you leave the soil bare, and there's nothing stopping the soil from eroding when there's rain. Okay, and this eventually leads to erosion and buildup of silt. Okay, which leads to problems for forests in the future. It can cause flooding. Okay, because what will happen is all that dirt's got to go somewhere, right? So it rolls down gradually down the hill into a creek or a gully or something, and then it fills up. And then that creek or that river that might used to have been navigable, you can get a boat down it. Now you can't because it's filled up with dirt. And then if that river ever gets filled with a big heavy rain, it doesn't have as much room to hold the water, so it's more likely to flood out and cause damage. It also makes it harder for the forest to grow back because they lose that soil that they need for nutrients for trees and stuff in the future. This becomes such a big problem that in the 1930s, when the New Deal happens, there is like a whole part of the government created to stabilize the soil and to get rid of erosion across the country. Okay. There starts to be steel manufacturing in Birmingham, Alabama, and other major centers of industry. Okay, you start to see more coal mining in the South. Basically, the South is trying to do things other than just make cotton, but cotton is still the main cash crop. So the South is changing. It's not just going to be cotton forever, but cotton is still the main source of industry. Now, socially, the center of life tended to be, like it had been in the past, tended to be the church for both Black and white communities. In the South, the church is the center for people and society. And there are a lot of revivals in this period of time after the Civil War, and there's a lot of growth of churches. For African Americans, churches are a place for them to worship, for them to learn, for them to get an education, for them to socialize, and also to have a degree of independence that they don't really get anywhere else. Okay, all right. Churches are one of the places where African Americans can be in charge of everything about their church. Okay. And across the South, there are lots and lots of churches, okay, as great stabilizers and custodians of social order. Okay. Churches helped, teach people the customs and morals of the society. And it also provided people a sense of hope, okay? To believe that Jesus is your Savior, that died for your sins, so that you can go to heaven, can provide people a great sense of comfort and relief in difficult times, okay? And to have a church community that can support one another in times of difficulty can also be helpful. And the church also enforces social order. Okay, making sure that people are on the straight and narrow and, trying to discourage behaviors that are socially unacceptable. Okay, congregations were often small and isolated out in rural parts of the South, so they could only attract a preacher once or twice a month. A lot of preachers did this thing where they would ride a circuit. Okay, so preachers are in high demand, but there's not a lot of preachers in the South. So what you see is a preacher might go from one church to another church to another church. He might have 3 or 4 churches, and every week he goes to a different one. And, when he shows up, they have church, and then he goes to the next town, they have church, moves on. What's also very common are the big revivals. Now, churches are pretty well segregated all across the South, but for many African Americans, like we talked about before, this was like, for them, this was something that they wanted, to have their own church that they could rule over themselves. Okay, churches. Yes.
It said that it was segregated by gender.
So that was typically, common is, and that was even common back during like the Pilgrim era, is to have the men and the women sit separately. Not that they don't have church, like they go to the same church, but like men would sit on one side and women would sit on another side. That was fairly common, or else the different families would sit together. Possibly the reason is to enforce like chastity, like again, you're going to church, you're not going to, go on a date. Of course, actually churches were a place for people to socialize and meet new people, and young boys and young girls would, meet each other and see each other at church, and that could lead to courtship and marriage. But my guess off the top of my head without researching it more is one of those things where it's like, keep your mind focused on God, not on, a lady in another pew, that sort of thing. I guess that's the idea. And that sort of thing would happen. Typically, though, churches tended to have more women than men, okay? And churches would be a place where a lot of people would go, and they don't have TV, they don't have Netflix. A lot of times people go to church because it's like the only thing to do. But for a lot of people, church is like the most important thing to them because they're thinking about their salvation and their life after this one, okay? Probably one of the most famous things you notice about the church is something we talked about last semester is the camp meeting. And this continues in the South, okay? And there's a lot of religious devotion. There's a lot of evangelicalism, people going through revivals, okay? Where a preacher comes into a town, they meet out in like the woods in a big old tent for like a week, they come out every night for a couple hours, every night, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday to Sunday or whatever. And they have revival. And, there's preaching and it's focusing on telling people how they need to get saved, how they need to stop sinning. And these camp meetings were big production events where lots of people would gather, and this was, in some ways entertaining. In a lot of ways, it's for people's spiritual health. But you see, like the camp meeting, this is a lot of people. And you see a lot of preachers, gain national prominence, like the preachers that are particularly successful and particularly popular, they get bigger and bigger audiences. And you see these big evangelists going across the country. And some of these evangelists, they start working and changing society, okay? We're not quite there yet, but the growing movement against alcohol, the temperance movement, it really gets popular in the South because of religious movements, okay? Because of evangelical preachers getting people to repent of their sins, getting people to give up on these sinful ways, telling them turn away from alcohol. That sort of thing happens a lot in the South. And the South eventually becomes one of the early bastions of temperance, which is interesting because it's like in the beginning of America as a country, New England was where you saw like the more really conservative, faithful evangelical Christians. But after the Civil War, and even leading up before the Civil War, you see more of that moving into the South. And even today, there's higher membership in churches in the South. There's higher numbers of evangelical Christians in the South. And this shift is important to notice, okay? All right. Well, we talked enough about the South for now, okay? We've talked about the South for the last couple of weeks. It's time we talk about the West, okay? We're past the Civil War now. The major issue of American history has been resolved. Slavery is no more, okay? Last semester, that was like the driving conflict in so much of our discussions was the argument over slavery. How can a country that claims to be free have it legal to own people? Well, we've solved that question. We pretty much got rid of slavery. Now, racism, that's still here. Problems, segregation, oppression of African Americans, that's still around. And it's still around today. Not as bad, but there's still problems. But now that we've solved that problem of slavery, where do we turn our attention to? America points its eyes westward. Let's take a moment and let's look at this painting. This painting is called American Progress. It actually was a lithograph by this artist. I believe his name was John Galt. I may have that wrong, but I'm pretty sure it's John Galt. We can look it up later. This is American Progress, and we're going to identify some symbolism in this painting, okay? So, in order to see this painting well, I'm going to turn off the lights, okay? Don't fall asleep. Don't do untoward things, okay? It'll be all right. So, let me move this little icon. I don't know if when I move this icon, oh, it's kind of creepy on the little video. Okay, so before we go any further, let's look at this painting. What do you notice about this painting?
People are traveling. The angel.
The big lady, right? She's usually the first thing you notice, right? She's just like kind of floating. What is she doing?
Holding a book.
She's holding a book, yes. She's got a wire.
Oh,
And
it's
where's
an
she-
electric wire. It's a telephone wire.
Close.
Like to connect.
Where's she going?
To like the
West.
road.
How do you know that she's going west?
You use a compass.
Northeast, southwest.
Right, west is left on a map, right? So she's going to the left and she's going west, okay? This is Columbia. She is a female personification of America, okay? Right? She's got a little star on her head, she's kind of floating, pure and white, yada, yada. Now notice the wire, that's a telegraph wire, okay? You know, she's got a book, a lot of times like books. I think there's a title on the book, but we can just like confirm books represent what? Knowledge. Okay, good. All right, so let's keep on looking. What do we notice? Let's look at this painting. What do you notice on the left side of the painting compared to the right side of the painting?
Dark.
The mountains, it's dark. This is, light. Okay. All right, what's right here? Can y'all tell what this is? These are buffalo, okay? These are buffalo. What do you see here?
Indians.
Some Indians, they're running away.
Oh, a horse.
Okay, a horse. Okay, then we've got, all right, so real quick, the furthest west, we've got wild animals, buffaloes, Native Americans, okay? Let's move a little bit further to the east, okay? What are these people?
Mormons.
Mormons?
You.
They might be Mormons, okay? It's possible. In fact, I actually showed you this painting when I was in 8th grade, by the way.
Yeah, I remember
But,
seeing that.
okay, he's got a little pickaxe, okay? Miners, okay, there you go. All right, here we got a little wagon, right? Okay, what are these people? Settlers, farmers, homesteaders, okay. We got this one dude riding on a horse, okay? He might represent the Pony Express, which was like a letter carrying service across the West where they would like ride horses really fast across the country. We got a carriage. Then we've got some actual farmers, right? And then what's over here?
A train.
Train. And what's this? Bridge, river. Okay, all right, so, you know, symbolically, this could be the Mississippi River. This could be the Rocky Mountains. And so this could be like the Great Plains, okay?
New Mexico.
American progress. America is progressing. We're moving forward. That's the idea. Now, there are some interesting quirks about this painting. But one thing you notice is the West is dark
Why?
and the East is bright. Anyone want to tell me why?
They don't know that much about
The
it.
unknown is dark.
They're unknown.
Knowledge is pretty.
There's a word. Starts with a C.
Charisma.
No.
Civilization.
Civilization. Okay. As you progress to the east or to the west, you see a change in technology, right? At the extreme west, it's wild animals and Native Americans, which U.S. citizens, Americans, look down upon Native Americans. Okay, there's this common belief that Indians are savages, that they have no sophisticated society, and there's a common belief that they're just like bloodthirsty monsters and need to be exterminated, which is untrue. Indians had a very complex society that Americans really just didn't bother to understand, okay? Because they occupied land that we wanted, and it gave us a nice excuse to get rid of them, is to call them savages, okay? Now, you see the technology progressing. You see a covered wagon, and then you see a stagecoach, which is, you know, the covered wagon's pulled by oxen. That's like a farmer. They're going to bring oxen to pull plows and to like start a farm with, right? When you have a horse-drawn carriage, you're not going to set up a farm, you're traveling, okay? And that's a nice fancy carriage, not a simple wagon. And then you've got a railroad that's like really sophisticated. And then you got a telegraph wire that's even more sophisticated. And you've got these miners and they're traveling, and there's even like a little like bear, I think, in the bottom left corner. But you got the miners, they're kind of some of the first people that settled. Then you got the farmers behind them, and you see a little house that they're setting up, and you start to see the connection. So this painting is like multiple time periods all at once. It's like showing a transformation in society. Now, this painting obviously has a very pro-Western settlement perspective, okay, to think that Western settlement is a positive good. And for many people in America, this is how they thought of the West. They thought this is the inevitable march of progress. Remember the phrase manifest destiny that was used to justify the Mexican-American War. The idea is that it's America's destiny to expand westward. It's our destiny to settle these lands and to occupy them. This is God's will for the country, that we own this land. That's the idea, okay? And so Americans pursued the occupation and transformation of the West. And a lot of times people consider the West, or what they call it, is the frontier, the edge of settlement. I'm going to turn the lights back on in 3, 2, 1. Okay, now, American Progress is just a painting. It was actually used as an advertisement to get people to like buy railroad tickets or go out to see the West. It's like saying, like, be a part of this. And lots of Americans moved to the Western United States after the Civil War. There's a variety of reasons why they do this, but most of them are economical. There are some African Americans who leave the South and go out west called the exodusters. There are some people that moved out west before the Civil War for religious reasons, the Mormons, and we talked about them last year. The Mormons, they were kind of kicked out of the rest of the country because they wanted to have, polygamy and other stuff. And then they like settled in Utah, and then the US government, the Mormons had like a miniature civil war, but they're still out there, so they had to give up they had to eventually give up the polygamy thing. There's still some Mormons that do the polygamy thing, but most Mormons do not. They're like, and they wouldn't claim those Mormons anyways. They're like, they're the ones that got kicked out or whatever. Anyways, moving on. But a lot of people are moving to the West for economic reasons. Okay, a lot of people move to the West to mine for precious metals, like miners. There's a lot of people that move out to the West to be farmers. We'll talk about why. And there's a lot of people that move out west to get into like the cattle ranching industry, to build railroads, to get into logging, and all sorts of different reasons. But they go to the West. They go to the frontier. Okay? There's all kinds of advertisements across America in the time period right after the Civil War, advertising land in the West. The reason why is a little law called the Homestead Act of 1862. Homestead Act of 1862 is one of the most important laws in American history, okay? It is basically free land for anyone that wants it, okay? The Homestead Act of 1862 gave away 160 acres of free land to anyone who would move out west, settle on the Great Plains, start a farm, and live there and build a homestead and stay there for 5 years. If you lived on that land for 5 years, it was yours. Okay, you just had to fill out the paperwork, maybe pay a little fee to do the paperwork, but basically 160 acres of land for free. That is ridiculous, okay, today, all right? I'll tell you a little secret. I bought about an acre-ish of land in the city of Como last year, back in like March and April, okay? And it was in town, so it wasn't like quite the same as just buying like land in like a big old, pasture or whatever, but it was pretty expensive, all right? We're talking today, modern day value, 160 acres of land is going to be hundreds of thousands of dollars, okay? Depending on the quality of the land, all right? But it gets better. If you're married, you get double, 320,000. And for every kid you get $80,000 as well. So a married family of a mom and a dad and 2 kids, they could move out west, set up a homestead, live on there for 5 years, and they would get right around 500 acres of land for free. Okay, with 320 plus 8, 480,000, 480 acres of land. Okay, that's a lot of land for free. This is very, very appealing to people across the country. And lots of people pack up their bags and move west. Okay, a lot of farmers in the south and in the north, they were struggling with the fact that, their farms might be small. Remember, in the early days of American settlement, it was kind of that way as well. That's how they got people to come to America, was they offered them free land. In Virginia to grow tobacco, in Massachusetts, etc. That was how they got people to come. But at this point, most of the eastern United States is settled and densely populated. Okay, if you want to start off on your own and have your own new farm, you either got to pony up a bunch of money, or you got to go work on someone else's farm and save up and save up and save up to buy a little sliver somewhere. But you're telling me you can just go out there and work for 5 years, which you're going to do anyways. Okay, why not go out west and start a farm? Okay, it's risky. You're going to be going out in the middle of nowhere and you won't know nobody, and your nearest neighbor might be 2 or 3 miles away from you. But if you can make it work, you'll instantly become wealthy. 500 acres of land in almost any other part of the world. You go to England and you own 500 acres of land, you're probably one of the richest people there. Okay? In America, anybody can. And this is not just limited to people in the United States. People from other countries, people from Europe move to the United States to become farmers because they want that land that is so freely available. The United States wants these lands to be settled. We don't want it to just be wild, okay? And so lots and lots of people move out into the Great Plains, okay? The Great Plains is that geographic region roughly between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains, okay? It's characterized by relatively flat terrain and a lack of forests and a great deal of grass, okay? Right? It's a relatively cool climate that is not desert dry, but it doesn't rain a whole lot, okay? And so the land is just solid grass, okay? This is where the buffalo roam, okay? Because they're herding animals, right? Native Americans tended to live nomadic lifestyles, and it's partially because of the grass. Look, you wouldn't have a state like Nebraska or Kansas without the Homestead Act of 1862, because nobody would just want to live there. It's very difficult to actually do anything other than hunt buffalo until you have new inventions, okay? One thing that's going on in the land in the Great Plains is that there's this stuff called sod, okay? Have you ever laid out sod in the yard before, done some yard work? Sod is the layer of roots and soil under the grass. Okay, so your grass has roots. If you ever try to dig a hole in the grass, you'll notice that you have to go through a couple inches of grass, and then there's the roots and stuff, and then you yank that off, and then it's just dirt. Okay, that's sod. Sod, round about these parts, isn't that thick because a lot of the dirt has been worked or moved or whatever. We have dry spells and wet spells, things like that. But out in the Great Plains for thousands of years, this grass has been allowed to grow undisturbed. So in some parts, you'd have a 1 foot or 2 foot thick, deep roots of sod, which was almost impossible to break up with plows until John Deere invented the steel plow. Yes, that John Deere. He invented the steel plow, a new type of plow that's much stronger and much more powerful, and they use it to literally bust up the Great Plains. The sod busters is what these people are called. They bust up the sod. Now, if you move out west, you got the land for free, but if you look at the resources, there's not a lot that you got involved. Hopefully you get somewhere close to a source of water, or you can dig a well. Hopefully you have some trees in your lot of land that you get. But the good land goes away pretty fast, and then the leftover land is what's left, and there's not a lot of trees. So a lot of these sod busters, they end up building their homes out of that sod. This is a sod house. It's made out of roots of grass. They like chopped it up into little bricks, and they just made their houses. And I mean, that's kind of what bricks are made out of anyways. Bricks are made out of like mud and hay and stuff. So anyways, over the course of the last part of the 19th century, from 1862 to 1900, lots and lots of Americans moved west of the Mississippi River and start setting up homesteads, okay? They start setting up farms. But there is a problem with that. And that's what we're going to hopefully talk about tomorrow, because there's other people that claim this same land, all right? So with that, we're going to finish off. You guys have a great day. Do good things, be good people, make good choices.